Thank you for joining us for Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And each week we invite you to send in your questions and we'll explore the fascinating stories of the city of Mississauga together. Like, subscribe, and follow us and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga. Joining us this week is a returning favorite of ours, a friend of Heritage Mississauga in the program. This is Richard Collins. Richard is the former president of the Mississauga South Historical Society, local Port Credit historian, interpreter, museum professional, and general person about town in terms of the local history scene down in South Mississauga, and with a passionate interest in all things that roll on rails and float in the water, I guess.
Yeah, I think you were saying, I was the conductor this weekend for Carisaga, which was a big event at the Canadian and Irish Pavilion. So yeah, I looked good in my conductor's uniform.
See, we should have had you with the conductor's hat on. Anyway.
Yeah, that was, So, I have it here.
Richard, as always, thank you once again for joining us here. So one of the fascinating things about, this time of year is, the warm weather comes and, people with some idle time invariably wander down to beaches and waterfronts to enjoy the ambiance and the cool breeze coming off the lake. And I was struck not too long ago, just driving down into Port Credit, just how many people congregate around the harbor, whether it's waterfront trail or the restaurants and patios and, the wharfs that you can walk out on. And it struck me that, water has always drawn people. This is not a new phenomenon. For generations upon generations, people have been drawn to the Credit River and the shores of Lake Ontario. And so, one of the neat things when, for someone like me, and I'm sure like you, that, sit and ponder back on the history of a community is, how that harbor has evolved and in the course of evolving, what it might have been when other visions take place. But so Port Credit Harbor has an interesting history, and it really, other than the natural harbor itself, it begins, just before, and we'll get to Frederick Chase Caprio, and he plays a significant role in the development of the harbor. But in 1834, we have the emergence of the Port Credit Harbor Company, who had these first designs on creating something a little bit more than the natural harbor. Can you walk us down a little bit of kind of the history of the harbor, and maybe we can just explore it chronologically a bit? And the
early harbor was there wasn't much of a harbor here. I remember when Simcoe, Sir John Graves Simcoe, came by. And he was checking all of the Lake Ontario shoreline, looking, where should I put my capital? And he didn't have any comment at all on Port Credit, even though he must have been here. Seems like Elizabeth, his wife, was taken by the harbor, and she met the indigenous people here, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and talked about them. So she seemed like the harbor more than he did. But yeah, it was around 1834 that a few British investors, among them William Chisholm, who was already developed the harbor in Oakville. So he was an experienced harbor master and developer. And Sir John Beverly Robinson Jr., the son of the man who's where you are right now at the Grange, and a few other British investors. They made an arrangement with the Mississaugas of the Credit, because they still owned the land. The Mississaugas of the Credit kept the land on 1 mile on both sides of the Credit River after the rest of the area was the Mississauga Purchase was sold to the British Crown. And so because they were owners of the land, the group of British investors and the Mississauga Credit formed the Port Credit Harbor Company to build a modest harbor, just to get some commercial business going. There wasn't a lot in Port Credit itself to generate much revenue for the harbor, but a lot of the farmers that lived north of Port Credit, where Cooksville and Streetsville, Arundel, all that area is now, at least it was convenient for them. They could ship their grain and whatever else they had down the river and then get it to markets in Toronto and Hamilton and elsewhere by the harbor. So by the 1840s, 1850s, it was quite a thriving harbor, mostly just catering to the farmers in the area. Not a lot of industry though, but a vital enough harbor.
Yeah, so you also have the connections to staves, wood being shipped abroad, and that's where the Stave Bank Road gets its name from in that early trade association. But all basic rural trades, right? Like it's not a big industrial harbor at this point. Like
never was. Whereas Oakville was, for as far as William Chisholm was concerned, it was his main harbor. Yeah, because there had been some industry. Yeah, but it thrived well enough until around 1850. Well, 1855, as I mentioned before, two disasters hit the Port Credit Harbor, both in the same year. In April, there was a terrible fire, which completely destroyed because the wharfs, the docks, they were all made of wood. The warehouses were all wood. So this fire completely wiped out the harbor in April. Now they could rebuild, but then something much worse came through town in December, and that was the Great Western Railway. And that was stiff competition because the railways could go 365 days a year. They were faster. Again, the lake and the river will freeze up, but the railway tracks don't. So the harbor never really recovered from the fire and the arrival of the railway. And while it sometimes frustrates people when I do tours of Port Credit, and people in Port Credit are very proud that it's a port, and we'll get there in a minute because it very much is a port now, more so than ever. But for a long, long time after 1855, Port Credit wasn't much of a port. There wasn't a lot of industry here. The Credit River is nasty for dumping silt. It's a very slow-moving river, and it's very flat from about Mississauga Golf and Country Club down to the mouth of Lake Ontario. So the silt tends to drop and build up. So the owners of the Port Credit Harbor were constantly dredging to get rid of the silt. Even just this past, well, here in 2022, the cities had to dredge the river to get rid of the silt. So it's an ongoing problem. So
right. Well, you had those echoes of challenges passed down through time. I mean, Port Credit may have evolved into a different type of harbor, if the railway hadn't come, if the fire hadn't happened, but they become landmarks. But then you have another big if, and that is the arrival of maybe your personal hero, Frederick Chase Caprio and General Manufacturing Company. And he had visions for a very different future for Port Credit, most of which never happened, of course. But can you explore kind of what might have been with somebody like Caprio, or Madcap as he became known?
Yeah, what might have been would have been amazing in some ways and quite ominous in other ways if it had come to pass. He was a man of great visions and very little money. So he couldn't get investors to make his plans, and he wasn't much of a hydrographic engineer either, because he overestimated the power of the Credit River. But his big scheme was to turn Port Credit into this major industrial town by using the Credit River as the source of power. Now, there's no electricity. This is 1860s, so mills are still being run the old-fashioned way with water wheels that would turn a wheel that would make pulleys, operate sawmills, or saw blades, or grist stones, and things like that. But he thought, well, if I own the river and all the land for 1 mile on both sides of it, because he purchased most of the land that originally belonged to the Credit Mississauga Nation when they kept all that land after the Mississauga purchase in 1805, then I can, he just envisioned having stone mills lining Port Credit, all the way from Port Credit up to, who knows, well, his land went up almost to Dundas Street at one point. And then maybe building along the shoreline and having aqueducts that would carry water from higher upstream so the water could fall down at the mills. And so, imagine Port Credit just being lined with stone mills. Someone referred to his company, the Peel General Manufacturing Company, as its goal was to turn Port Credit into the Manchester of Canada. Manchester, in the UK, was kind of the birthplace of the cotton mills and the first steam engines and things like that. But of course, it never worked out because the river didn't have the power. There wasn't nearly enough volume to make this all happen. It's a beautiful river. I don't want to trash the Credit River. It's the backbone of the city, and I love it. And it is a wonderful scenic river and a beautiful recreational for walking and strolling. But as far as being useful for power as a canal, it was never lived up to Cap's dreams. So
and like you said with Caprio, he was unsuccessful in getting the investors to really follow his dreams and schemes. He went on to other things, like he was in railways and canal building and things like that. But
yeah, well, he tried to turn the credit into a canal at one point,
yeah.
but again, just wasn't wide and deep enough. I shouldn't say he was a total loser, because he did invest in the early gas company in Toronto, which was successful, and they lived in a nice home in Toronto. So it's not like everything he did was a disaster, but most of what he did was a disaster. And then, at one point he got involved with a railway running between Toronto and Georgian Bay, where he was very much a promoter. He was a slick operator. So he'd originally gotten here in the 1830s with a banking firm in the UK to settle some disputes between the different fur trading companies, which were very unscrupulous themselves. So he wasn't a man of great scruples when he got here, being a British banker and dealing with Canadian fur traders. But yeah, he tried to build a railway, didn't have the money himself. So, but as a promoter, he eventually got a bunch of people together to build this railway between Toronto and Georgian Bay. And as soon as they started building the railway, they realized they didn't need him as a promoter anymore. And since he didn't have enough money to be one of the investors, they just kicked him off the board. And it was gone. That was the Northern Railway. And yeah, so little things like that. So that was a railway. And then he felt slighted about that, decided, well, I'm going to build a canal along the Humber River to compete. And then again, great dreams of a Humber River canal that never passed.
Yeah, yeah. Just a colorful and thankfully, in a sense, when we look at our local history, we have individuals like this who do add these layers to our stories in terms of the evolution of our landscape. Of not only there was a great book recently a few years ago called Unbuilt Toronto: The History of What Never Was, or something along those lines, of Mark Osbaldiston. I always think of a Caprio of the history of what never happened.
Yeah, it could be a very thick book of wonderful dreams and schemes, and Port Credit would certainly have been a big chapter in that book. And there's an idea for us. Maybe we should, Heritage Mississauga, we should sit down and write the.
There we go.
The unbuilt Caprio.
The history of what never happened. I think we got something there, Richard.
Yeah. And there is a little town north of Sudbury that is called Caprio. It's an important junction where the railway main line from Montreal to Vancouver, and then the branch from Toronto to Vancouver, they meet up. So yeah, again, it's not a total loser. It's a nice little village that's an important junction for CN today. That's called Caprio, Ontario.
So the harbor doesn't, Caprio ultimately has minimal impact on the harbor despite his designs. It really is the emergence of kind of that local trade. I remember referring to it as a place that the boats got parked. You have the Stonehookers and the fishery that evolves in the later half of the 1800s. It's a major port that's in that sense where the vessels and the sailors call home in terms of their trade engaged on the water, and that breeds new life into the harbor. And so can you walk us through a little bit of that timeline? And
yeah, after the grain trade and the railway had pretty much taken on most of the business, Port Credit slumped for some time, but from the 1850s on, but around the 1880s, stonehooking became the big thing, and people in Port Credit they love the stonehooking history because it's quite unique. There was really only 3 harbors where stonehooking took place. Stonehooking was where nice hard shale, flat, very solid, very firm stone, great for construction, great for building big ominous buildings. My understanding is that the base of Queen's Park is built of Port Credit slate. So it was, and this was the days just before Portland cement, which became the first practical construction material for big buildings. Cement's been around since the Roman Empire, but was never really practical. So stone was a great thing at the time. And yeah, between Port Credit and Whitby and Bronte, today are still 3 communities whose historical societies are constantly bouting back and forth as to which one was the real center of the stonehooking trade. But Port Credit folk are really quite proud of it, and they should, because it's quite a unique period, because the stonehookers were kind of like pirates in their own way. When you're into fishing or the trade where you're moving grain and the products from the farmers, you had to register your tonnage to let people know how much shipping, because the government needed to charge you. They had to charge you customs and excise so they could make some money. But the stonehookers were the kind of people, they could pick up their shale from the just about 20, 40, 80 feet out into the water, pick it up, load it onto the boat, and take it right to Toronto and Hamilton and sell it. They would never register it, even though they should have. And so there's kind of idea that this is this independent trade to pick up the stone, ship it to markets and sell it, and come back and pick up some more stone. So there's a bit of a rebellion factor to these stonehookers, which is another reason why I think Port Credit people are attached to the Port Credit trade. But the fact is, it didn't last that long. Shale, as we've often said before, it's a non-renewable. I guess it is a renewable resource, but you kind of have to wait a few million years to develop new shale resources. So they quickly used up all the shale that they had. There was a limit that prevented them from harvesting shale too close to the shore, because that would compromise the shoreline, but they did anyways. And sure enough, as we'll talk about in later years, the Lake Ontario shoreline at Port Credit was compromised, a lot of erosion taking place because the natural shale wasn't there. But one way or another, by around the 1900s, within 30 years, the stonehooking trade had come and gone.
They really ended themselves in that sense, where they harvested what was harvestable, and like you said, a few million years to rebuild the stock. So in about a million years from now, we'll have the stonehookers return. Is that the
maybe it might come into fashion again, although again around 1900, early in the 20th century, Portland cement became the preferred. We still use it, concrete, things like that. So maybe a million years from now it might be fashionable again.
I remember talking to the late Lauren Joyce, who we both know and loved, and just the authority on the Port Credit Harbour and the Stonehookers locally. And I remember him saying that Queen's Park, the old City Hall in Toronto, if the building ever started to lean forward, it's because Port Credit took its stone back. That was
there's some notable buildings in Toronto and Hamilton. I think the old Hamilton City Hall, which isn't there anymore, and the old TH&B railway station, both gone, sadly. There's a lot of Port Credit stone in these big cities.
Well, like I said, a ready building material in an age before concrete, but both concrete and the depletion of the stone in terms of easily accessible stone for harvesting really ends the trade in short order. So it's kind of like this I guess celebrated romantic part of our history, but it really is a short-lived part. Fishing, of course. Well, and we can talk about fishing, but you were saying that the stonehookers did have an adverse effect on the shoreline, and kind of what we see today in Port Credit is actually, in terms of the parks we walk on and the paths we follow, are actually as a response to what stonehooking did to the environment.
Saddington Park and J.J. Plaus Park they're all lake fill. They were all put in in the 1960s and 1970s. To shore up the shoreline, because erosion was starting to eat away. There are some houses in Port Credit north of Lakeshore Road now that used to be south of Lakeshore Road and got moved in the 1960s and 70s when Saddington Park moved in, because you're losing the shoreline because the wave action was constantly. I mean, it's a natural thing; it's going to happen, but the shale would have slowed that process down. I
was going to say they took the buffer out. So you have, from kind of as the stonehooking waned, you have the fishery comes in, and I don't think we do have, of course, the sports fishermen that operate out of Port Credit, a few of them out of the Port Credit Harbour today, but we don't see that commercial fishery any longer. But for a period of time, it was a happening thing in Port Credit, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. You mentioned Lauren Joyce, and he does love to talk about the stonehookers, but most of the Joyce family and a lot of the other families, they made their trade with fishing. It was much more important to the Port Credit economy long-term than stonehooking. Was just, commercial fishing, whitefish and perch mostly, which are not really marketable nowadays in the same way that, when you go to the store, you get halibut and cod and haddock. The Atlantic and Pacific fishing trades pretty much put an end to the Port Credit, the Great Lakes trade through the 1940s and 1950s. But yeah, for about a 50-year period from around 1900, when the stonehooking trade died, and in the 1950s, a lot of fishing, a lot of the families in Port Credit were fishermen. There were again, to the Joyces, the Pickards, the Hares, the Blowers, the Blocks, the Andersons, a lot of families that are still around Port Credit today that were engaged in this trade. But again, it died out in time too, when the Atlantic and Pacific fishing trades became.
Well, there were predatory fish too, like the lamprey eel came in, and then they also had the zebra mussels that depleted fish stocks as well. And so yeah, it had its challenges. I know they've reintroduced salmon to the Credit River as well, so the sport fishery is there, but the commercial fishery is of yesteryear out of Port Credit anyways. And so no, but just again, a much longer lived but perhaps less piratey.
It didn't make Port Credit unique, because a lot of towns in Ontario, along Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, did it, as opposed to stonehooking, which was kind of unique to just this area where the shale happened to be.
So let's switch gears a little bit, and one of the an icon of a harbor is invariably its lighthouse, and Port Credit's had a couple, one of which met a rather colorful demise, and then the one, of course, we see today. Can you walk us through kind of the story of the lighthouse? We know built in the original lighthouse, not the one we see today, but built in 1884 by Roderick Cameron, and but really also was short-lived in that sense. But anyway, can you walk us through the story of the lighthouse?
It was kind of short-lived, and again, it frustrates people when I say this, but a mostly useless lighthouse, because again, the peak was 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. Things really started to drop for the harbor in the 1870s, and lo and behold, the government decides to build a lighthouse in 1884, at which point most of the trade was out of Port Credit for a long time. I mean, it was still useful enough, because it was still a beacon for the Port Credit boaters, the marine fishermen that were there. So it wasn't entirely useless, but it wasn't. It was intended to be built to kind of revive the harbor, and that didn't happen, again, because of the other problems: the silting of the river, the lack of local industries that didn't need it. But it was like any port town, it was a landmark from 1884 until it was decommissioned in 1918. So how many is that? 30 years. Yeah, it was in service, and after that, the government just stopped putting money into lighting it and paying a lighthouse master. John Miller was the lighthouse keeper for the longest time, because it just didn't need it anymore. So it sat there derelict from 1918 until July of 1936, when the story goes is that three teenagers from Port Credit High School they rowed a boat out, because by this time the pier that led out to it had been destroyed, I think around 1918 by a storm, and that's one reason why the government decommissioned it. And so the only way to get out there for lightkeeper Miller was to row a boat out to the lighthouse. And so these three teenagers got onto a lifeboat, or rather a rowboat, took it out to the lighthouse, and I guess that's where they decided to go smoking, because maybe that's what teenagers did at the time. And the story goes, one of the kids must have dropped one of the cigarette butts down the crack between the two wooden slats, and the lighthouse caught on fire, and in a few hours it was gone.
So that was the end. So 1936, we have the end of the lighthouse, and then, flash forward a few decades later, and a current lighthouse, the one we see today, and the one that really residents are very proud of, that oversees the harbor, but was added to the landscape.
That was built in 1991, and I remember it must have been when Councillor Tovey, because he headed up a campaign to have take photographs of Mississauga, show everyone your favorite spot in Mississauga. And the number one most photographed spot in Mississauga was Port Credit's Lighthouse. Just type Port Credit Lighthouse into Google, and you'll find thousands of pictures. It is quite a photogenic. Yeah, so in many ways, our 1991 lighthouse is a bigger star than the original 1884 one ever was.
And it does connect with a thought. It's something we don't often think about Mississauga, but we are a port city. We have a port on a major Great Lake that connects to potentially connects to worldwide markets and through the St. Lawrence and beyond. So we don't often think, at least I don't. It doesn't seem to be in the public consciousness necessarily that we do have this port. We are like,
and it still is
a
in
port
business.
city.
Yeah, it's in business. So if you like old, like watching boats coming in and out, big ships, you can still do that in Mississauga. Not in Port Credit. We'll talk. Port Credit's much more a recreational harbor now, but there used to be a lot of big coal lakers that used to come into Lakeview when the generating station was still there. It's gone now, of course. But in Clarkson, Suncor, the origin, the British American, and then Gulf and Petrocan, all those years, there are still ships that come in almost on a couple, 3 or 4 times a week, bringing in petroleum. And then next to that is, I always forget the name of it, HRM, something. St. Lawrence Cement is what people in Clarkson still call it. Limestone comes in on a regular basis, and processed cement mix goes out. So you can still see big commercial freight shipping going on in Mississauga, but you don't think of it because it's just isolated to that one corner of Clarkson.
And there was a brief time also when Canada Steamship Lines did call Port Credit home, and so those lake freighters, for again a very brief window of time, called the big freighters would come into the Port Credit, and that's where we see the what is it? I'm trying to think what the big building's called, but it's still
it's a big warehouse. Yeah, there is a great warehouse that the government built in 1962. Late in the 60s. You may recall one of the more momentous occasions in Mississauga's history is when when the Conservative government under Diefenbaker at the time canceled the Avro Aero, and that put hundreds of people in Port Credit out of work, thousands of people across Mississauga, tens of thousands over Mississauga and Toronto area. And so, the member of Parliament, Gordon Graydon, wasn't popular at the time. And so the government thought, well, if we want to keep this seat in the next election, we have to do something to get some business back. And one of the plans was to turn the Port Credit Harbor into a commercial harbor. And so, they put a lot of money into lake filling, putting in a huge warehouse building that for the moment is still there. I fear it's going to be gone someday soon when they develop that. And then in 1962, Canada Steamship Lines decided that they would lease out that space with a big plan to start a package freight business rather than the big tonnage of coal and limestone that you see that came into Port Credit. They decided to get kind of a Great Lakes kind of a FedEx operation, package freight, where if you order something, no online, no Amazon back then, but if you ordered things from the catalog, from the Eaton's catalog, stuff like that, it could be delivered instead of coming by truck or train. If there's enough of it, it could be shipped from places like Montreal and Toronto to Port Credit, and then into delivery vans from there into local houses. So there was home delivery long before Amazon, because Eaton's and Simpson did it. And so the big plan was, CSL had harbors in Montreal and Toronto, but they were right in the downtown, or right in the busy area, and they wanted to move out to areas where there wouldn't be so much traffic congestion to get this package freight delivery going. So in Montreal, they moved out to a harbor in Valleyfield, and at the same time from Toronto, they moved out to Port Credit. And that business went smaller ships, but faster ships for carrying and easy loading and unloading instead of the big gantry cranes that would dump coal or limestone, whatever. They had the side doors that would roll out, and trucks could move right onto the inside to pick up the package and move it out on pallets and things like that. So it must have been quite a busy operation when it was at its peak, from around 1962 till around 1973, 1974. But as Port Credit and Mississauga in general started to get really big at this time, it became impractical for cars to be able to move around. The QEW was getting too busy. So they just found that the delivery part of it on land was, it just wasn't working. And so they pulled out of the package freight business altogether in the late 1970s.
One thing we'd be remiss if we didn't touch on too, that again, the evolution of the harbor was the arrival of the Port Credit Yacht Club, which kind of made that transition. It was coinciding at the time with the fisheries were still operational, and this is before Canada Steamship lines. But that transition from commercial harbor to what we see today, the recreational harbor, Port Credit Yacht Club, or PCYC, certainly has a role in that story as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Just when the lighthouse could have served some purpose, because the Port Credit Yacht Club moved in 1936 and would have been a useful beacon for the recreational sailors. That's the year the lighthouse went up in flames, and so, but that did open up the harbor to the Port Credit Yacht Club. They moved onto the east side of the river and was a busy harbor. At one point, over 100 members, over 100 boats were docked there. There were some boat builders on the other side, on the west side of the river. So there was some boat building and boat repair trade going on at the time. And a lot of that was thanks to the Port Credit Yacht Club that kept these businesses going, repairing.
And of course, it still thrives today, although it moved to Lakefront Promenade. So that's where PCYC calls home today. But
1989, yeah, they
1989. But maybe we'll end this exploration of the history of the harbor on I know something near and dear to your heart, but it's the old Ridgetown. The arrival of the Ridgetown, it serves a practical purpose, but it also becomes kind of an iconic. I don't know. Do you call it landmark or watermark?
I guess it's more of a watermark than a landmark, but it certainly is. It's a rusty old hulk of a ship that was built in 1905 and carried iron ore from 1905 till almost 70 years for the Inland Steamship Company, and never around this area. It was taking iron from the iron ranges in Minnesota to the steel mills in Gary, Indiana, near Chicago. So it rarely served in this area, but it was decommissioned in 1973 and was sent to Port Weller at the north end of the Welland Canal to a company that was going to scrap it. And the town of Port Credit decided, hey, we'll buy this old rusting hulk. Now, what they wanted it for was as a breakwater, because the harbor was getting to be a popular recreational harbor again. Bruce McLaughlin, of all people, you might know him from Square One and the Mississauga Valley's very important developer in the Square One area of Mississauga. But he took out a lease on the government lands to turn it into a recreational harbor, and had the plan to put this. What you needed was a breakwater, because of course the water constantly lapping against the shore is eroding the shoreline, and any boats that are docked there are bouncing up and down with the waves. So you put literally a breakwater in to stop the waves from making the boats bounce up and down. So usually you'd put a stone pier in or a concrete that would stop it. In this case, the town of Port Credit says, hey, we can just scuttle this old ship, fill it with rocks, and just sink it into place, and it will work as a breakwater. And that's what it does today. And it's very much a landmark. It's I can't imagine what it was like at the time. I wasn't living here in 1973, but I imagine there must have been people thought, you're going to put this ugly, god-awful, rusting hulk of a ship in our beautiful harbor. But now if you suggested moving it out to replace it with a stone pier or something, people would be furious if you tried to move the Ridgetown now. It's a Port Credit landmark.
Absolutely. And so we invite people too, if you're interested in exploring the history of the harbor, is walk along JJ Plaus Park, and you'll see a series of 10 interpretive plaques that were put in late last year that outline kind of the chronological history of the mouth of the river and Port Credit Harbor, and the kind of trades on Lake Ontario, including the story of the Ridgetown, which originally sailed under the name of William E. Corey. But if you look closely at the Ridgetown name with some binoculars or something, you'll see the ghosted outline of its original name underneath the name of Ridgetown.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah, there's a little bit there. But with that, Richard, thank you once again for joining us here and exploring local history with us. You're a fount of knowledge, and I really appreciate your time.
No, thanks. I appreciate it. Anytime.
And thank you for everyone for joining us with Ask a Historian. Please join us next week as we explore more stories of the history of the city of Mississauga. Like, subscribe, and follow us, and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga. And we will see you again here at Ask a Historian.